Consciousness. In previous notes, the subject of consciousness was touched upon, with the term cosmic consciousness being encountered in tertium organum. The term, however, lacks clarity, and is indefinite, as in most cases what is referred to as cosmic consciousness is simply fantasy, or associative daydreaming connected with intensified work of the emotional center. This can sometimes come close to ecstatic revelation. However, most often is simply a subjective emotional experience on the level of dreams. Aside from this, before one can begin to talk of cosmic consciousness, there is need to define what consciousness is. Consciousness is considered indefinable, as classical science struggles to define something that it sees as an inner quality. With the ordinary means at our disposal, we find it impossible to prove the presence of consciousness in another person. We know it only in ourselves. This is scientific sophistry nonetheless, and the only thing that can be said to be true is that we can know consciousness only in ourselves. What is emphasized, though, is that we can know, but can only know it when we are in possession of it. When we do not have it, we can know that we do not have it, not at any particular moment, but afterward. Meaning that when it next recurs, we are able to note that it has been absent for some time, and find that we remember the moment when it disappeared, and again reappeared. It is also possible to define the moments when we are nearer to consciousness and further away from consciousness. By observing it in ourselves, by observing the appearance and the disappearance of consciousness, we inevitably notice one fact, that moments of consciousness are very short, and separated by long intervals of completely unconscious mechanical working of the machine. We then realize that we are able to think, feel, act, speak, and even work without being conscious of it. If we are able to see in ourselves these moments of consciousness and the long periods of mechanicalness in between, then we can see in others when they are conscious of what they are doing, and when they are not. The principal mistake consists of thinking that we always have consciousness, and in general either that consciousness is always present, or that it is never present. In reality, consciousness is a property that is continually changing. One moment it is present, the next it is not, and there are different degrees and different levels of consciousness. Both consciousness and the different degrees of consciousness must be understood in oneself by sensation, by taste, and by feeling. No definitions can help in this case, and no definitions are possible, as long as we do not understand what it is that we have to define. Science and philosophy cannot define our consciousness, because they seek to define it where it does not exist. It is also necessary to distinguish consciousness from the possibility of consciousness. We possess only the possibility of consciousness, and then only rare flashes of it. We cannot therefore define what consciousness is. The question is then, what is the most important thing that we notice during periods of self-observation? Some might answer that during attempts at self-observation, what can particularly be felt is an incessant flow of thought that is difficult to stop. Others may talk of attempting to distinguish the work of one center from the work of another. A third may note the connectedness of one thing with another in the system. The wholeness of the system as if it was some kind of organism, and the entirely new significance of the word to know, that includes not only the idea of knowing this thing or that, but the connection between this thing and everything else. The most important point, however, is that no one notices how they fail to remember themselves. We do not feel or sense ourselves, and we are not conscious of ourselves. It observes, just as it speaks, it thinks or it laughs. We do not feel that I observe, I notice or I see. Everything is still noticed or seen passively. In order to observe anything, we need first of all to remember ourselves. We need to try to remember ourselves during periods of self-observation, otherwise we do not exist during these observations and lose the entire aim of self-observation. First attempts at self-observation show how difficult it is. Attempts at self-remembering fail to give any result, other than actually showing us that we never remember ourselves. People who know this, however, already know a great deal. The trouble is that few actually know or realize it. If you ask a person whether or not they can remember themselves, they will of course answer that they can. If you then tell them that they cannot remember themselves, they will either get angry with you or think you are an utter fool. The whole of life is based upon this, the whole of human existence and the whole of human blindness. If a person really knows that they cannot remember themselves, then they are already near to the understanding of their being. All that we have learnt so far, all attempts at our own self-remembering, should show us that we are faced with an entirely new problem that science and philosophy have thus far failed to point out. Let's first though examine attempts at self-remembering, or to be conscious of ourselves. To say to yourself I am walking, I am doing, and continuing to feel this, is to stop thinking. When I am feeling then I can neither think nor speak, and even sensations are dimmed. When this is attempted, you find that you can only do this remembering for a very short time. If you tried during vipassana or breath meditation to stop thought, as for example is described in Edward Carpenter's book From Adam's Peak to Elephanta, then first attempts at self-remembering appear to be somewhat similar. It is almost the same thing with one exception, that in stopping thought during meditation, attention is wholly directed towards the effort of not admitting thoughts, whilst in self-remembering, attention becomes divided. One part of it is directed towards the same effort, while the other part is directed toward the feeling or awareness of self. This can provide an incomplete definition of self-remembering that nevertheless may prove useful in practice. When speaking of the division of attention that is the characteristic feature of self-remembering, then the following might be stated. When I observe something, my attention is directed towards what I observe, which can be represented by a line with one arrowhead flowing from me to what is being observed. When at the same time I try to remember myself, then my attention is directed both towards the object observed, and towards myself, and a second arrowhead then appears on the line. Having defined this, we can see that the problem consists of directing attention on oneself, without weakening or obliterating the attention directed towards something else. Furthermore, this something else could just as well be within me as outside of me. First attempts at such a division of attention reveal its potential, whilst at the same time two things become clear. Firstly, that any self-remembering resulting from this method has nothing in common with self-feeling or self-analysis. It is a new and interesting state, with a strangely familiar or nostalgic flavor to it. Secondly, although moments of self-remembering do occur in life fairly rarely, only the deliberate production of these moments creates a sense of novelty. We are actually familiar with them right from early childhood, where they have come to us in new or unexpected surroundings, in a new place, among new people, and for instance when traveling, when suddenly one looks about and notes, how strange I am in this place, or in very emotional moments, in moments of danger, in moments when it is necessary to keep one's head, or when one hears one's own voice, and sees and observes oneself from the outside. Our first recollections of life, perhaps very early ones, as early as 4 or 5 years of age, are moments of self-remembering. We only remember those moments of the past in which we remember ourselves. Of other moments, we know only that they took place, but are not able to revive or experience them again. The moments, on the other hand, in which we remember ourselves, are alive and in no way different from the present, so can be lived and relived again and again in our memory. So many things disappear in our memory. Why do we experience so much simply in order to forget it afterward? A person feels something that seems to them at the time very big, and they feel sure they will never forget it. 1 or 2 years pass by, or perhaps 5, and nothing remains of it. It should thus become clear why this is so, and why it could not be otherwise. If our memory really keeps alive only moments of self-remembering, then it becomes obvious why our memory is so poor. With further study and the ability to divide attention, we might observe that self-remembering gives wonderful sensations, that in a natural way by themselves, come to us very seldom and in exceptional circumstances. If, for example, you walk the city streets late at night, then try to sense the houses and the streets, you will find that certain houses, particularly old houses, are quite alive, and you can all but speak to them. There is no imagination in it. If you do not think of anything, simply walk by whilst trying to remember yourself, and look about you, then the sensations come all by themselves. Ouspensky notes amongst his observations whilst exploring self-remembering, an occasion when he was walking in St. Petersburg along the Litany towards Nevsky, and in spite of concerted effort being unable to keep his attention on self-remembering, because the noise, movement, sights and smells distracted him. Each minute that passed he lost the thread of attention, found it again and then lost it, until at last, feeling a kind of ridiculous irritation, he turned into the first street he came to, having firmly decided to keep his attention on the fact that he would remember himself. Or at least try to for some period of time, at the very least until he reached the following street corner. He reached the Nadejdinskaya without losing the thread of attention except perhaps for short moments, and then again turned towards the Nevsky, realizing that in quiet streets it was easier not to lose the line of thought. Then, wishing to further test this newfound ability in noisy streets, he reached the Nevsky, still remembering himself. Experiencing a strange emotional state of inner peace and confidence that comes after great effort of this kind, he suddenly spotted a tobacconist where they rolled his particular brand of cigarettes. So, still remembering himself, he thought to call in at the shop and order some cigarettes. Ouspensky then reports waking up 2 hours later in the Tavaricheskaya, far away from the Nevsky. The sensation of awakening was extraordinarily vivid, where he felt almost as if he were coming to. He recalled how he had been walking along the Nadejdinskaya, remembering himself, and thought to order some cigarettes, then how at this thought he seemed to immediately fall and disappear into a deep sleep. At the same time, whilst immersed in this sleep, he had continued to perform consistent and expedient actions. Left the tobacconist, called at his flat, telephoned his publisher and written 2 letters, then again went out of the house walking up the left side of the Nevsky, up the Gostainoy Dvor, intending to go to the Ofitserskaya. He changed his mind as it was getting late, took a cab, and whilst driving along the Tavrocheskaya began to feel a strange uneasiness as though he had forgotten something, suddenly remembering at that moment that he had forgotten to remember himself. In my own experience, I've patrolled sites late at night when there is little traffic, and whilst doing so, chanted Theravada mantras repeatedly in my head, to try to focus attention on remembering. Whilst doing this, I've driven up to a location, got out of the vehicle and walked around the perimeter, checking the wall, buildings and fence. On completing this circuit, have written in an occurrence book at the guardhouse, to indicate time of arrival there, and status of the site. Getting back into the vehicle and still chanting in my head, have driven to the next location, a distance of some 2 or 3 kilometers which should take no more than a couple of minutes. On arriving at that location, looking at my watch while exiting the vehicle, noted that 20 minutes or 25 minutes had passed. The distance covered was only 2 or 3 kilometers, and I remembered covering that distance, however cannot explain how suddenly 20 minutes or more had been lost. The mileometer on the vehicle showed a short distance had been traveled, so I could not have been driving around absent-mindedly all that time. The exact opposite has happened on another occasion when, whilst patrolling, and again repeating Theravada mantras over and over in my head, driven up to a location and noted the time in the occurrence book as being 5 minutes past 3 in the morning. Walked around the location, got back in the vehicle and driven on to the next location perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers away, then arriving there once again checked my watch to note the visit in their occurrence book. The time was 7 minutes past 3. Rechecked the time with the officers on site, radioed back to the previous site, asking the time noted in their occurrence book. I appear to have walked around an entire site, driven to the next location and got out of the vehicle, all in the space of 2 minutes, which is impossible. Managing to do 10 minutes work in the space of 2 minutes, stretching that time? The center or core of this system, therefore, and of all work on oneself, is this act of conscious self-remembering. Work of that nature is not simply empty rhetoric but real fact, filled with significance, thanks to which psychology becomes an exact and at the same time a practical science. European and Western psychology in general has overlooked a fact of tremendous importance, namely that we do not remember ourselves. That we live and act and reason in deep sleep, not metaphorically but in absolute reality. At the same time, however, we are able to remember ourselves, and if we make sufficient effort in this direction, we can awaken. This idea of self-remembering is alluded to in the publication Wundt's Logic, where you will find his definition of apperception. He describes simple observation there as being perception and observation, with self-remembering as being apperception. Wundt comes close to the concept, but afterward goes off in another direction, failing to realize the magnitude of the idea that was hidden behind his thoughts about different forms of perception. Not grasping the magnitude, he could not then see the central position that the idea of an absence of consciousness, and the potential to voluntarily create this consciousness ought to occupy in our thinking. It is difficult for some to grasp this idea that is hidden by an impenetrable veil for many otherwise very intelligent people. We shall examine shortly why this is so. In right knowledge, the study of man must proceed along parallel lines with the study of the world, and the study of the world must run on parallel lines with the study of man. Laws are everywhere the same, in the world as well as in man. As above, so below. Thus, having mastered the principles of any one law, we must look for its manifestation in the world and in man simultaneously. Furthermore, some laws are more easily observable in the world, whilst others are more easily observable in man. In certain cases, therefore, it is better to begin with the world, and then to pass on to man, whilst in other cases it is better to begin with man and then to pass on to the world. This parallel study of the world and of man shows the student the fundamental unity of everything, and helps us to find some analogies in phenomena of different orders.